Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to Reset Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Political Science we will be talking about Indian Discourse on Identity and Development. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science in Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha has over 25 years of teaching experience and he is an expert on political theory and Indian political thought. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you, Amrit. Good afternoon. Today's lecture we are going to devote on Indian discourse on identity and development. In fact, when I say development, of course it is different from the idea of growth, because development is a much broader concept which include growth as well. And these two issues, identity and development, are today very important from the point of view of democracy, not only in India, world over. In fact, one can say that identity and development issues are integrally tied with the idea of democracy, which is perhaps the dominant creed of modern times. So therefore, these two issues require a lot of attention, and accordingly social science has been dealing with these issues in recent years in a big way. Politically also, these two issues are quite significant, because modern societies are basically moving in direction of more and more democratization, and democracy requires a lot of things, particularly a kind of non-hierarchical society, citizenship rights, and a certain level of economic growth, redistribution, and so on and so forth, that democratic ideas are properly implemented and enforced. So therefore, what one finds that this identity issue at times comes into conflict with the question of development, because identity formation has a different trajectory. In fact, human beings have different types of identities, and some identities get crystallized at certain moments in their lives. Every society faces this problem, particularly related to identity, because one person can have multiple identities in multiple situations. But certain identities are definitely important from the point of view of social harmony and from the point of view of political process. Therefore, those identities are at times recognized, those identities are addressed, those identities are rather factorized and factored into the political discourse, which is the discourse perhaps through which the democracy moves in modern times. Now, of course, on these two issues, both identity and development, we find that in theory, in political theory, there are a lot of debates among liberals and the Marxist scholars, the two traditions which have been reflecting on this issue of identity and development. In fact, to some extent one can say that both schools of thought consider identities in certain situations dysfunctional, and only those aspects of identity which are dysfunctional for liberal scholars are problematic, and they basically try to deal with those dysfunctional dimensions of identities. So far Marxism is concerned, it has a different take on identity. In fact, Marx himself considered these all social processes through which identities are formed as epiphenomenal, and therefore part of superstructural realm of society. Only perhaps he considered some space for nationality or identity which is formed around the question of nationality, though of course he had a strong reservation on the idea of nation and nationalism, because he tried to relate them also with the growth of capitalism and the class interest of the bourgeoisie. But nonetheless, in fact, so far Marxism is concerned, its take on religion, it takes on its take on a number of other identities, whether nation or for that matter anything else, is fundamentally different from what a liberal school of thought has been arguing on this. But in recent years, what we have seen that not only in India but different parts of the world, the question of ethnic identities have become important. And therefore, both from the point of view of national integration, nation building project, formation of nation states, as well as from the point of view of discrimination, exclusion, assertion of rights. These issues keep coming off and on in the political discourse, not only in India, but in other countries of Africa, Asia, and Latin America in particular. And in recent years, we have seen that this has also been coming up again and again in some of the Western democracies. So therefore, these two things are important: identity and development. Now, in fact, so far India is concerned, from the very beginning, India had to deal with both problems in a more imaginative and creative manner, because India was under the colonial rule, and the Britishers who were ruling India had their own framework to deal these two issues. Of course, so far development is concerned, they didn't have much concern with the question of development, because as a colony, they were only interested in extracting surplus. They were not interested in developing infrastructure. They were not interested in the well-being of the people. But so far as identity is concerned, they played with this question, both politically and socially to its hilt. And therefore, what we find that during the colonial period, a certain framework was enforced and institutionalized by them, the framework to deal this question of identity. And that framework became so effective, so powerful, that has continued in one form or the other even after independence. Even in the Constituent Assembly, when India was drafting a constitution for itself, in fact, some of the ideas which had crystallized or which had come up during the colonial period through exchange of views, through the dynamism of politics, through the kind of interaction and engagement which Indian people had with the colonial masters, that had resulted into certain framework, and that framework in fact was debated, deliberated. Some of aspects of those, that framework were also incorporated into constitution, which we will take up later, but of course many of them were abandoned, because the Britishers wanted, or basically went for, an identity solution of the problem. Because there are three different ways in which identity question is handled today. One is basically the handling of identity question through majoritarian framework, which many countries in the world have done. In fact, including our neighbor Pakistan. In fact, there is another way to deal with this identity question is through consensual mode or consensual method, and that method is becoming quite popular. And of course, federalism is also part of that consensual mechanism, and along with many others, which we will basically refer to later. And the third is the deliberative solution. And that is perhaps the more rational, modern, democratic solution, that how identities can be brought into public discourse, or identities can be rationally dealt with through debate, negotiations, deliberation, and within the framework of democratic politics, how identities can be dealt with without giving any sense of discrimination, exclusion, or victimization. So therefore, this deliberative solution. Of course, so far as the Britishers or the colonial rulers were concerned, or colonial rule was concerned, they perhaps preferred a not consensual and deliberative, but one can say that they went for identity solution of the problem, because they tried to reify identity in such a manner that identities didn't have any linkages with other aspects of society. So therefore, reification of identity was important for them, because the two important issues they confronted at that time. One was the demand, the clamor for self-rule from the Indian people, because they wanted self-rule, and that self-rule was becoming a governing idea or governing principle of democracy in modern times. So therefore, this clamor for self-rule among people was sought to be neutralized through other aspect of that rule, that the shared rule, to some extent one can say that self-rule and the shared rule, as it is called today in discourse of federalism, particularly multi-level federalism, that federalism is a shared rule, and multi-level federalism that is decentralization is basically the self-rule. But what at that time happened, when Indian people rose in revolt, when Indian nation idea of Indian nation started crystallizing, when Indian nationalism got feet to stand upon, what we find that the Britishers try to neutralize it by invoking certain other categories, and one such category was the identity. That Indian people, don't have one identity, that is a national identity, but there are a number of identities which are here, and therefore nationalism or nation or Western construct, they are not meant for people like India or the society like India, which is underdeveloped, which is poor, where there is illiteracy, people have not graduated to that level of consciousness, and therefore for them other identities are important. And within that identity discourse, they try to give this impression that there are dominant identities and there are subjugated identities, and therefore Britishers were not representing simply the colonial interests, but they were discharging their responsibility towards less developed civilizations like India. So therefore this imperial discourse of civilizational discourse they wanted to push here, that Britishers had come here simply to empower the disprivileged identities in these societies, disempowered or those groups who are not privileged enough, and therefore they were here to empower them. So this is how they wanted to deal with this question of identity, and it is in this context we can see that number of mechanisms they evolved around that time. For example, the mechanism of reservation, the mechanism of weightage system, the mechanism of veto, mechanism of to some extent one can say federalism, because Britishers were not familiar with this federal discourse, because it was essentially American construct. But nonetheless, when it came to India, they had to also to recognize, they had to basically acknowledge the important role which federalism could play in these societies. So therefore this Muslim League Congress conflict around this question of federalism with autonomous provinces and so many things were part of this larger discourse. What I am trying to say that during colonial period, this identity issue started becoming quite important. Though of course India is known to be a society of multiple identities, there are different religions, there are different languages, there are different caste groups and number of things, and therefore it is a plural society, multicultural society. Of course, many people don't call it multicultural in the sense that within this idea or the framework of multiculturalism there is a basically implicit meaning that groups have to be non-hierarchically organized, but nonetheless they said that even if it was not multicultural, it was plural. There were multiple identities existing here. But there was no such political contestation among these identity groups earlier. But the moment this entire process started during colonial period, and here perhaps the Rippon's reforms of 1884 was very significant, when for the first time what happened, this entire electoral process came into existence at the local body, the district boards. And this is how many historians, particularly the Cambridge School of History, which has basically argued that it was around that time that politicization of identities took place and identities came in the public sphere through this electoral process. And this competition and contestation led to number of churnings in the society, and some of those churnings of course were militating against this entire idea of nationhood, that self-rule, and perhaps that suited the colonial rulers as well. Because this when Indian National Congress spearheaded that campaign for freedom and for self-rule from the Britishers, the argument was that Indian people constituted a nation and therefore they deserve freedom. But when this churning started, Britishers started using this churning to basically present the counterpoint of view that India doesn't constitute as one identity but multiple identities, and therefore this entire idea of self-rule is fallacious. So this is how this entire contestation, entire discourse basically materialized during the colonial period. But subsequently during the this constitution drafting phase, that is the Constituent Assembly, what we find, a new situation emerged. India was moving towards a republican democratic order. India, particularly after partition, it decided to settle for a different type of framework through which democratic rights could be ensured to people. Citizenship discourse could materialize. Where basically this where citizenship rights could be ensured, and therefore it was not possible for them to simply fall back on the earlier framework which was practiced during the colonial period through number of mechanisms which I just mentioned, reservation, separate electeds, veto system, weightage system, etc. and etc. So what was the solution? In which way India could move and proceed? Of course, there were a number of examples through which democratic institutions and democratic process had been imagined and visualized in the West. But some of those ideas were not to be purely lifted from their experiences, because Indian challenges were different. So therefore, what we find that a creative engagement to this question of identity takes place during the constitution drafting process, that is in the Constituent Assembly of India. And here we find that two types of identities were identified based on the differences among people in society. The first difference was the first order difference, and the second was the second order difference. The first order difference, that is the difference on account of human beings as a separate entity or separate identity. This first order difference was sought to be tackled through a mechanism what we call a franchise, universal adult franchise. But the second order differences which emanate from a number of identities, and that is something which results into the caste identity, religious identity, linguistic identity, regional identity, and so on and so forth. Those identities were, the second order difference emanating from these identities was sought to be tackled through other mechanisms, and those mechanisms were, of course, so far language was concerned, it was sought to be tackled through a language principle, three languages, national language, official language, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this was, the question of language, along with the idea of linguistic states. Then the question of, multiple legal systems emanating from different religious, systems was tackled through the idea of uniform civil codes. Then, of course, the idea of religion was sought to be tackled through idea of secularism. The issue of caste discrimination was sought to be tackled through the idea of reservation. So, second order difference was sought, was basically handled through number of mechanisms, and those mechanisms found place in the constitution and got the sanctity, the constitutional sanctity, whether it is the language issue, the official language, the national language, three language formula, that national language, then there will be a language for official transactions, and then there will be a regional language, and then of course the concept of official language, the idea of having a 8th schedule, recognition of languages in the 8th schedule, and so on and so forth. So this was one way. The other issue was, of course, the caste discrimination. This was sought to be tackled through the idea of reservation, that how certain disprivileged sections could be empowered, and by the empowering could be done through this mechanism of reservation. But here again, the reservation was not imagined in the same way as it was done during the colonial period. It was basically it had a more nuanced, they had a more nuanced understanding of this question of reservation. Therefore, what happened that they separated the two things, the reservation for scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, and reservation for other backward classes, by having a provision in the constitution under Article 340 that there will be a commission instituted by the state to look into this issue, that who are the socially and educationally backward classes, and what type of support and what type of prop they require from the state. And accordingly, as all of us know, that two commissions were instituted by the government of India. One was the Kaka Kaleka, another was the Mandal Commission. And accordingly, on basis of those recommendations, as per the directive of the constitution, the question of reservation was tackled. But so far scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were concerned, they were identified as the groups which required some protection, some support on basis of historical injury, the victimhood, the concept of victimhood, and therefore that need to be compensated. And the compensatory idea of justice came into play here. What is called positive discrimination, or one can say that reverse discrimination. Positive discrimination, or basically the kind of protection which is given to those who have suffered on account of certain identities in history. So scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reservation came in that category. Other backward classes reservation came into other category. So therefore, the concept of social justice, the concept of reparative justice, these issues came into play during the Constituent Assembly, when this question of dealing with the second order difference emanating from this identity of caste emerged. So for the question of reason as an identity, the question of linguistic groups as an identity located in certain territories came up. It was sought to be tackled through another mechanism. Of course, that was as I mentioned, that emerged in North America, particularly United States of America, that is the idea of federalism. Of course, even in colonial period during the British rule, this idea of federalism was very much in circulation. But that idea of federalism at that time had a different baggage altogether, because what happened that at that time it got associated with the Muslim League's demand for a separate nation, and therefore it carried a communal bogie. But after independence, particularly during the Constituent Assembly phase, it got sanitized, and federalism became a very important framework to deal with certain types of identities, particularly regional identities emanating from the linguistic basis. So therefore, federalism was another mechanism to tackle this second order difference. Similarly, the question of religion, which is important for not only India but all modern societies. This was sought to be tackled through the idea of secularism. So secularism, social justice, and federalism were three dominant ideas and framework through which the second order difference was tackled. Along with that, number of mechanisms tied to these ideas came into play, and therefore I mentioned the question of dealing with language, particularly that in a society where the people speak different languages, how people speaking different languages should not feel discriminated. All of them have a sense of dignity, all of them have sense of participation, all of them have sense of power sharing, and therefore this type of elaborate scheme to deal with this language problem was basically imagined, where you have 8th schedule and certain languages are recognized in the 8th schedule and they have a different type of function. You have national language, you have language for official transaction, and then you have language for transaction, both official and non-official at the regional level. So therefore 3 language formula and so many other things. So this is how these 2 order differences, the first order difference emanating from human identity, which was sought to be tackled through the idea of universal adult franchise, and the second order difference emanating from other identities, which are basically normally it happens in all societies. It was sought to be tackled very creatively and imaginatively by the Indian Constituent Assembly. What we find that after independence, we find that some of these solutions which were attempted there, and therefore when it comes to more theoretical understanding of this solution, as I mentioned, the 3 different types of solutions which are basically in circulation in theory, in political theory. One is a majoritarian solution, other is a consensual solution, and third is a deliberative solution. India, in fact, one can say that this entire framework which emanated from this deliberation in the Constituent Assembly, one can put it in category of consensual and deliberative, not majoritarian, because federalism is also part of consensual solution. Reservation is also part of or affirmative action is part of consensual solution. Of course, there are many other mechanisms which are part of consensual solution were not entertained, including the idea of veto, including the idea of weightage and so on and so forth, which were in practice, particularly in colonial period. And then deliberative solution, that turning a cultural category into political, through the process of democratic engagement. This is how a deliberative solution basically takes place, and therefore some of these identities were purely cultural, social, were brought into the political realm, and therefore their nature got transformed. And the moment they come into political realm, sometimes they can have negative fallout, sometimes they get also positively engaged with, and they sometimes result into certain positive development for democracy. Because then what happens that in public sphere, when they are dealt with politically, the cultural and social identities instead of playing negative role get resolved through deliberation and negotiation. And this is how perhaps modern democracies at times try to solve these question through a deliberation. So therefore, both deliberative solution, because they were brought into the political sphere, in the public sphere, and they were dealt with politically. Of course, here one must recognize the deft handling by the political leadership and the role of political judgment. So therefore, in the formative phase, what we find that as per the design, the constitutional design, as per the imagination of the founding fathers, what happened that constitutional and the deliberative solutions were attempted. And therefore, initial results were also quite encouraging. Apart from few instances where we could see some resistance, some resentment, some sort of, one can say, that protest, that more or less people tried to play the political game as per the constitutional design. And therefore, what happened that it appeared that Indian attempt to deal with this question proved quite beneficial and quite advantageous for this nascent democracy. So what happens therefore that Indian discourse, we can say that on identity has been very creative, but how it got tied with the question of development, because development and identity, these two things move together. One can say it is a three-legged race between the two. So this is very important, because unless you discuss the two, you cannot basically discuss properly the democratic process of any society. So basically, this is the situation so far as the identity and development question is concerned. Thank you. In this session, we'll discuss this question of identity and development, that how they together contribute or can hinder democratic process in any society, and India is no exception here. Now this entire engagement with identity and development of democracy, one can say, is a three-legged race. And unless both are seen in a more creative and more imaginative way, democratic process and democratic politics can always suffer. Now, where India stands in this entire debate and discourse on the question of identity and development today, because if we turn our eyes, we run our eyes on the the entire map of the world, what we find that this question of identity and development are plaguing most of the democracies, not only in the East but also in the West, which claims to be a developed democracy. Of course, earlier it was believed that Western societies are homogeneous, and therefore identity problem is the problem of the East. And therefore, when it was era of imperialism and colonialism, in the name of civilizational discourse, they always presented it as a problem of the less developed, underdeveloped civilizations of the East like India. But today what we find that because of number of factors, including migration of people in recent years, even the Western democracies are facing this problem of identity. Identity related conflicts, identity related competition, identity related pressure on democratic process. And therefore, in recent years what we find that political theory is replete with instances where scholars of repute have engaged with this question of identity, and perhaps multiculturalism and communitarianism, the two dominant strands within political theory, are result of such trends in modern times in politics. But India, so far India is concerned, much before multiculturalism and communitarianism made their appearance on the horizon, in fact India had to deal with this question because of the actual problems which were existing and emerging in society, and that of course was the result of a long colonial period. As I mentioned earlier also, that during colonial period, Britishers tried to use this identity to serve their own interests, to puncture this claim of one identity or national identity, or the claim for selfhood which Indian people were basically pushing for. Therefore, they always use these identities to portray a different situation, that there is no one identity but multiple identities, and all identities deserve selfhood, and therefore not one selfhood but multiple selfhood. And therefore, this churning which was taking place in India, not purely a British creation, but some of the churnings were fallout of Indian wrongdoings, including this caste discrimination and so on and so forth. Therefore, it suited them and used this question of identity to basically deflect this entire attention from nationhood and nationalism. But that was one context. But later on, when basically these identities got crystallized, and therefore this assertion, the churning for self rule became very prominent and loud and powerful, what we find that through this constitution drafting, in that moment of constitution drafting, that is the Constituent Assembly, we find that a very creative engagement took place with this issue. Even in the Constituent Assembly, there were two moments so far as this dealing with this question of identity was concerned. One moment was, of course, in the report stage of the Constituent Assembly, when various committees which were formed within the Constituent Assembly came with their reports on Union Powers Committee, on fundamental rights, on minority question, and so forth, so on and so forth. So at that stage, we find one framework emerging, which was not much different from what basically had been created during the British period, the colonial period, whether separate electorates, or one can say this weightage, veto, etc., etc. But the second stage came when it was a question of draft, when it was the moment of drafting the constitution. This is called drafting stage of the constitution. Here we find that a radical break happens, and this is particularly around 1949, when reservation for minorities was withdrawn, and caste and community were disentangled, because as we know that before that there was a category called minority. During colonial period, even those who are today called scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, they were considered part of the minority, and for minority protection there are a number of mechanisms. But in this draft stage of the constitution, that is 1949, this what happened, this concept of minority underwent changes, and caste and community both were disentangled from each other. And the caste, and in order to deal with this caste, discrimination, and particularly those disprivileged castes, the idea of reservation remained there, but the idea of reservation was fine-tuned, and therefore this idea of social justice and reparative justice came into existence. The reparative justice, that those who have suffered on account of certain identities in history, and particularly in Indian context it was identified with reference to untouchability, and those injuries have to be rectified, have to be compensated, and therefore this compensation has to take place through this mechanism of reservation, and therefore this was the compensatory justice, the idea of reparative justice emerged. On the question of social justice, that it was not on account of historical injury, but rather on account of circumstantial discrimination, where both the caste and the class factors come into play, a different type of engagement, imaginative framework emerged here. And it was here the question of social justice came. And here, as we all know, that Article 340 was inserted into Constitution, that a state will institute a commission to look into this question, that who are socially and educationally backward classes in society, who deserve certain certain help, certain protection, certain props, certain support, and therefore on basis of that recommendation state will act. And accordingly 2 commissions, Kaka Kalekar and Mandal, were instituted. So social justice and reparative justice. So the idea of justice was fine-tuned. The question of federalism, as I mentioned earlier, that in colonial period it got associated with communal politics because of the Muslim leagues, entire stress on federal, politics, particularly provincial autonomy, residuary powers to states, and so on and so forth. At least till 1928, Nehru Committee report. Later on, they graduated to a different level of political discourse when they started a separate nation. So therefore, from so long they worked within this framework of minority, the Muslims as a minority, a Muslim League asking for number of measures to protect minority interests. Federalism was a very powerful tool in their hands. But when they graduated from minority to nationality, and they said that Muslims are not only minority but nationality, therefore they are a nation, and therefore they want to rule, self-rule, then of course it was a different politics. But that happened in 30s, particularly after Nehru report, that in 1928. But what happens that in Constituent Assembly again, we find that federalism, the earlier concept for which the Congress leaders, Indian National Congress leaders had misgivings, not got rather sanctified, sanitized, and federalism became a very important tool to deal with certain types of identities, including regional identities, linguistic identities, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we find that in Constituent Assembly, at the report stage, a different type of framework was in circulation. One can, say the framework which was more or less similar to what we saw during the colonial period. But at the drafting stage, we find that a radical break happens and a different type of framework emerges, and it is about this framework I was mentioning that one can call it constitutional and deliberative framework, under which number of ideas came, number of tools were devised to deal with this question of identity in democracy, including federalism, the idea of positive discrimination and affirmative action to reservation, and idea of having a very specific framework to deal with the language question, the 3 language principle, the question of 8th schedule, the official language, national language, and so on and so forth. Question of religion, how secularism became a very powerful idea here. Of course, again, the secularism had number of manifestations so far as the constitutional instruments were concerned. Uniform civil code also became part of this idea of dealing with this second order difference. So first order difference was dealt with adult franchise. The second order difference was dealt with a number of tools and techniques and mechanisms which I have basically identified in the foregoing part of my lecture. So, what happened that after independence, when they were put into practice, how it worked? Some of them worked nicely. In fact, federalism in initial phase didn't have much problem, in spite of the fact that Nehru's leadership, which was visionary on certain issues on federalism, didn't perhaps do much so far institutionalization of federal politics is concerned. Rather, one can say that he informalized the entire federal discourse in India. In fact, no federal institutions could grow during that period. In fact, his fortnightly letters to chief minister, prime minister's fortnightly letters to chief minister replaced any formal institution so far as the interaction and engagement between the state leaders and the central leaders were concerned. Similarly, other things happened. The context was different. It was the period of one party rule, and therefore he could get away with such mechanisms, informal mechanisms. But later on, when centralizing tendencies developed in Indian polity, we find that this solution of this type of identity faced some problem, and therefore what happened, the demand for regional autonomy, the demand for secessionism grew in certain parts of India, including northeast, Punjab, Jammu and Kashmir, and so on and so forth. So therefore, this solution, this deliberative and consensual solution, showing first sign of crack in 60s, and therefore we have seen that how this federal problems emerge. So far, the other aspects of this solution is concerned, more or less had a smooth sailing. In fact, all ethnic identities or types of identities got domesticated within this constitutional framework. All of them basically were harnessed creatively, in the service of democratization and development in India. But of course, when in 60s and 70s, after 20-30 years, we find that in some areas again cracks started developing, including the issue of reservation. Some of the state governments had of course instituted commissions to look into this issue, but subsequently when this Mandal Commission was instituted in 1979-80, and on basis of its recommendation in 1990, it was implemented. It led to some new development, but later on through creative judicial engagement, through basically judicial intervention, particularly the Supreme Court in famous Indira Sawhney case, and later on also in 2008, 2008-9, what is called Mandal 2 judgment, the Supreme Court tackled this issue, and so therefore, as per the constitutional design, one can say that this matter was also tackled. A language problem, of course, happened in 60s, particularly in southern states, but later on, what we find that this matter was also tackled politically and constitutionally, and in recent years we have not seen much problem. And formation of linguistic state in 1956 played a big role in basically dealing with this issue of this identity, the linguistic identity. So therefore, what we find that the kind of solution which was attempted by the constitution in India worked well, and it has worked well over the years. But the thing is that, as I was mentioning, that this identity issue has to be seen within the framework of development, because ultimately identities, if are dealt democratically, if are dealt creatively, if it works properly, then it always facilitates development. But if there is not a deft handling of this identity question, it can always derail this agenda of development. And when I said development, it is not only growth. It includes growth, but it includes many things. Many indexes of development have to be considered here. So what happens that gradually we find that this initial solution or initial sign of a very successful dealing of this question of identity started showing cracks, and started impacting this entire process of development in subsequent years. So therefore, the question of development also becomes important. And before I basically deal that how this identity and development came into and interaction with each other, I must tell you that like the question of identity, India also had a very imaginative and creative engagement with development. And what was that creative engagement with development? Now, it is here I am basically tempted to quote cite two important speeches of India's first Prime Minister Nehru. The first speech he gave when in 1949, as I was mentioning, in the draft stage of the constitution, the reservation for minorities was withdrawn, and he said that it is going to be a turn in the destiny of the nation, because he thought that such mechanisms were the colonial constructs and would be detrimental to the cause of development. And the second statement he made when he was inaugurating Bhakra and Nangal Dam, and he said that this is going to be the temple of modern India. So these two statements are basically symptomatic, or one can say that can tell us something, that what was the thought, what was the idea, what was the vision of India's first Prime Minister Nehru. One made in 1949, another made much later as a Prime Minister of independent India. But what happens that this question of identity, as I told you, that going to be the turning moment in the destiny of the nation, the statement which made in 1949 on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, and that was basically a move in direction of taking Indian discourse on identity into this deliberative and conversational mode. But so far as this development is concerned, when he said it is going to be temple of modern India, one can see that how he gave importance to this development for democracy, that how this development will become a kind of source of both spiritual and material satisfaction of people. But what we find that was that hope was belied later, because of course India during that period was growing at the rate of 3.5. India's GDP was growing at the rate of 3.5, which was called by India's one of the eminent economists of India, Raj Krishna, as Hindu growth rate. And at the same time, we find that later on, because of this sluggish growth, by 70s, we find that Indian economy came under great pressure. What is today called license permit Raj, the great amount of regulatory mechanisms. And kind of centralization which happened basically created a kind of economic crisis in 90s, basically facilitating and necessitating certain new measures and perhaps the economic reforms in name of liberalization and privatization and globalization, that is called LPG, perhaps was the fallout of this process. But before we come to this issue, we have to look at the initial phase of India's engagement with this question of development. As we have seen in case of identity, in case of development also India had a very creative engagement, because before passing such judgment that India had a creative engagement, we must look at the available resources, theoretical resources at that time to deal with this question of development. What were the theoretical resources? And if we turn our eyes on the global map, we find that there are only two frameworks so far as this question of development was concerned, to deal with this question of development was concerned. One was the industrial model, industrial revolution model. Another was, the Soviet model. But, in the end, what we find that both models converged at one point. That was the question of primitive accumulation, that how to do primitive accumulation, because without primitive accumulation, in fact, economic development cannot take place. The industrial revolution model dealt with this question of primitive accumulation through enclosure movement, through basically liquidating peasantry, and this is what we know from the Western history, particularly history of Europe, that how enclosure movement took place. On the other hand, this question of primitive accumulation was tackled in Soviet Union through this collectivization drive of Stalin. Again here we find liquidation of peasantry. So therefore, in both models, the solution remained in liquidation of peasantry or the countryside and accumulation of capital So, therefore, one can say differentiation and depeasantization were these theories so far as this model of development is concerned. So, for ideologically you can say liberal model of development, ideologically you can say the Marxist or socialist model of development in 20th century, that is Soviet Union, but nonetheless in the end we find that both converged on that point, that is the liquidation of peasantry, primitive accumulation through liquidation, through violence, and finally, this depeasantization and differentiation and elimination or basically settlement of this question of agriculture, peasantry in the interest of industrialization, industries and accumulation of capital. Therefore, it is not just a chance that Barrington Moore Jr., when he wrote that great book in 1960s, Social Origin of Dictatorship and Democracy, he said that this entire question of democracy is tied with the question of the settlement of the peasant question. And he prophetically mentioned that if you have no bourgeoisie, you cannot have a democracy. Of course, he said that dictatorship in Germany, Italy and Japan was basically the result of this failure to settle this peasant question. And in other countries which basically flourished at democracy, they settled this question quickly, more effectively, efficiently, and therefore democracy could flourish in those countries. United States of America was an exception, because of course agriculture was commercialized. They had a different type of situation. They didn't have peasantry, they had only commercial farming class. Therefore, they faced a different type of problems so far as democratization is concerned. So, in fact, according to Barrington Moore Jr., whether agriculture is commercialized or not, it is key to understand the process of democratization in any society. And what we find that this question of primitive accumulation has been a running theme from Adam Smith to Arthur Lewis, so far as the political economy is concerned. And India had a kind of dilemma at that time, what to deal with this. Without development, Indian democracy cannot flourish, but for primitive accumulation, if it liquidates its peasantry and perhaps uses force and violence to go for primitive accumulation, it was also not proper, because Indian nationalism had powerful base in Indian countryside among the peasants, and number two, violence India wanted to simply abstain from. And therefore, this issue resulted into, one can say, very creative engagement with this question of development, the question of mobilization of resources, the Nehru's problem of resource mobilization, particularly from the point of view of the planners of his period, in fact, was sought to be tackled through three different mechanisms. The first mechanism was a rationalization of food grain trade. The second mechanism was cooperative movement through a small peasant farm, what we call his entire drive for cooperative movement. And of course, one can also mention here community development program and so on and so forth, because of which later on we had the Panchayati Raj institutions of Balwant Rai committee and other committees. Now, the third thing was, the first was of course rationalization of food grain trade, second was the cooperative farming, and the third was the purchase of food grain by the government through this, in order to create a buffer stock. This is what we call public distribution system as well. So, three mechanisms were devised to basically tide over this problem of resource mobilization. Of course, gradually, as many scholars have pointed out, that Nehru was persuaded to abandon the first and two, that is rationalization of food grain trade and the cooperative movement. And later on, he was persuaded and pressurized to scale down the third, that is purchase of food grain by the government, that is the buffer stock by the state level leaders. So, three mechanisms devised, but all three of them face problem. But what we find that still India basically surged through, particularly in this period, even within the range of 3.5 percent GDP growth at that time. But the problem of how to extract surplus from the countryside, because the countryside was already empowered through this idea of franchise, And India, therefore, one should remember that the only country in the world where democracy preceded development, so far the developed democracies are concerned. In world over, we find that democracy came much later. Even the question of franchise, the women's suffrage happened in the West in 20th century. India is the only country that at the time of independence, every adult citizen of India was enfranchised. So therefore, the peasants in India were enfranchised, they had the voting power, and therefore it was also not possible, like other countries, to impose any measure on them which was not acceptable to them in a democratic process. So therefore, this dilemma of resource mobilization, in spite of this sluggish growth, India tried to remain democratic and still trying to surge ahead with a very moderate growth rate. And combining the two, democracy and development was perhaps its singular achievement. Many scholars cite the example of the Eastern miracle, particularly the Southeast Asia and East Asia, Asian tigers. But one should remember that they achieved development at the cost of democracy, because most of the governments were authoritarian. In fact, world over, we can say that the how state used its power to promote capital and market, and how it used very violent method at times to basically promote growth. But India's commitment to democracy remained important and paramount, and Nehru perhaps privileged democracy over development at that period, and that perhaps is India's singular achievement. But of course, 80s and 90s, as I was mentioning, when the situation started going out of hands because of number of tendencies which developed in 60s and 70s, what is called license permit Raj and so on and so forth, centralization, over-regulation and other things. 90s, we went for economic reforms, and that economic reforms of course was not India's contribution so far as this the discourse on development is concerned. It was of course IMF, World Bank and many other agencies which were pushing for this idea both in African and Latin American countries earlier. But India at that time, when the balance of payment crisis happened, India also went for that. But what we find that even in era of economic reforms, this democracy and development both are basically going together. And within that framework, the earlier attempt to deal with this question of identity has also not been abandoned. So therefore, Indian discourse on identity and development is to be seen in this framework, which in my opinion is quite imaginative and creative, and perhaps sets an example for political theory not only in India but in the entire world.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Jha for coming to our lecture and delivering this wonderful lecture. Thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.